Have you ever felt a shiver of understanding? A sudden clarity that reshapes everything you thought you knew? What if the very foundations of safety, the lines drawn to protect us, were tested in ways we could never imagine? Not by an enemy, but by a quiet whisper of authority from the highest places. This is the story of those hidden tests and the unsung guardians who navigate the delicate balance between security and the profound trust required to uphold it. It's a journey into the quiet courage of those who stand ready, even when they don't know they're being watched. Instantly flip her from unknown threat to guardian actual, exempt, authorized, hands off. Her fingers hovered over the switch as she let the seconds tick longer than she had to, savoring the pressure building below her in Sector 47's command center. In her mind's eye, she could picture it clearly. Junior officers barking updates across the floor, a harried communications tech frantically querying national databases, a colonel leaning over someone's shoulder demanding an ID on this damn jet. Who the hell had the juice to turn restricted airspace into their own proving ground? Rachel did. 5 years ago, she'd been on the other end of this exact scenario, a younger version of herself sitting in an F-16 cockpit with her own heart hammering as she closed on a target, eyes darting between radar returns and the glint of a silhouette through the glass. It was strange how memory and muscle carried you back, how instinct told you exactly what these pilots approaching her now were feeling. Tension laced with duty, the training pushing aside the fear, their thumbs beginning to hover just a little too close to the triggers. The radio crackled again. This time the voice was sharp, clipped, and unmistakably stressed. Unknown aircraft, this is Sector 47 control. You are now inside final engagement envelope. Squawk immediately or you will be fired upon. This is your last warning. Through her headset, she caught what sounded like an aside from one of the pilots. The faintest hot mic chuckle over the squadron's channel. Who let their rich uncle fly his antique jet into our backyard? That had been earlier, before someone in the command center ran her authorization papers, before her name dropped in their ear like a lead weight. And just like that, the laughter had died. Her lips curved just slightly as she caught sight of them now through her windscreen. 3 gray F-16s in textbook tactical wedge, cutting across the sky from her 2 o'clock, sunlight gleaming off their canopies. Beautiful machines, piloted by young men and women who, for all their bravado, had no idea who sat in the drab little citation jet they were closing on. Rachel allowed herself to feel that irony. Her Cessna might look like an ordinary business jet, the kind some oil executive would use to hop between Houston and D.C., but buried beneath its skin was a surveillance and jamming suite that even now quietly collected every radar ping, every encrypted transmission, every mistake they made under stress. That was her job now, to find weaknesses, to be the phantom that slipped through cracks. On the ground, she could imagine the arguments escalating. Colonel Patterson would be there by now, storming into the command room and barking at the comms officer to get me an ID right now. And maybe even further up the chain, her file was already flashing on General Hayes's secure screen back at the Pentagon. Hayes knew this exercise was coming, of course. Hayes had signed her mission order herself, but no one here did. That was the point. Rachel glanced down at her stopwatch again. 4 minutes since she crossed into restricted airspace. Not terrible, not good either. In a real-world scenario, that was more than enough time for a hostile actor to wreak havoc. Her radar warning receiver was shrieking now, lit up like a Christmas tree. Multiple locks, each a different fighter, their targeting systems painting her, hungry for the kill. The jets were much closer now, their silhouettes crisp against the afternoon haze. She could almost see the pilots' helmets glinting, faces she'd never know staring back at her with narrowed eyes, fingers flexing against their HOTAS controls. She let them stew a few seconds longer, her heart steady despite the rising tension. She'd done this before. She was good at this. Finally, she flipped up the protective cover on her panel, thumb resting on the encrypted transponder switch. This was the moment where everything hinged. This was when they learned whether their clearance verification chain worked under stress, whether all those expensive drills and systems could distinguish a ghost from a real threat before someone did something they couldn't take back. The code she was about to send would instantly flip the board from red to green, strip the target designation off her little citation, and pipe a very different order down to the fighter cockpits. Guardian Actual, stand down. She took a breath, eyes still fixed on the approaching Falcons, and pressed the switch. Transform her from potential enemy to protected asset in a matter of seconds. That much she knew. But Rachel Monroe wasn't ready to grant them that satisfaction just yet. Not before she pushed them, just enough to see how close to the edge they were willing to walk before someone, anyone, in command finally demanded her identification. She needed to know. The lead F-16 was close now, close enough that she could make out the shape of his helmet through the canopy glass. Young, alert. Everything about him screamed discipline and training, a professional through and through, with the quiet, steely determination of someone prepared to do whatever his orders required. In less than 30 seconds, she thought, his entire sense of the world was about to tilt on its axis. The radio crackled to life. His voice came through first, crisp and cold, with that practiced edge of command. Unidentified aircraft, you are violating restricted military airspace. Change course immediately. Before she could even register a response, a second voice cut in, looser, younger, more casual, the wingman. Or at least wave hello. We're fans of classic aircraft. The rebuke was swift. You know, wingman, maintain radio discipline, the lead pilot barked. Sitting quietly in her cockpit, Rachel listened to all of it. She couldn't help herself. The faintest smile curved her lips, so subtle it barely existed. Amusing. Enthusiasm? Present. Professionalism? Lacking. She filed the thought away. On their HUDs, she knew, targeting brackets had already painted her citation jet. She could picture their fingers hovering near the weapon release switches, just waiting for authorization to escalate from bluffs to bullets. Not bad, she thought. Good protocol from the lead pilot. The wingman, well, that's why training existed, wasn't it? The radio flared again, and this time the tension in the lead's voice was impossible to miss. Control, target is non-responsive and continuing course towards sensitive infrastructure, requesting authorization to fire warning shots. The reply came after a heartbeat. Stand by, Falcon lead. Do not engage until authorized. Rachel could hear it in all of them now. The tightness in their tones, the strain in the control tower's voice over comms. This was exactly what she'd come here to see. How they held up when faced with real pressure, confronted by something they couldn't immediately categorize. Through her canopy, the lead F-16 was close enough now for her to see his posture clearly. Picture perfect, flying a precise textbook intercept. His wingman was staying in position too, though she could practically sense his mind still lingering on his earlier wisecrack about classic planes. The command center's voice came back, sharper now. Falcon lead, this is control. You are authorized for warning shots if the target does not comply within 30 seconds. Copy, control. Warning shots authorized in 30. The lead acknowledged, calm but clipped. Rachel's eyes flicked to the mission timer on her console. 6 minutes since initial contact. That was enough. Time to see how their verification protocols performed under maximum strain. Her fingers found the encrypted transponder tucked on her panel. Without hesitation, she keyed in the authorization sequence and flipped the switch. Instantly, her jet began broadcasting a coded signal. A signal that, if everything was still running properly 3 miles below, should light up every high-security protocol in the command center like a Christmas tree. On the other end of the airwaves, the lead pilot's voice broke in again, this time colored with surprise. Control, this is Falcon lead. We're receiving some kind of encoded transmission from the target. A pause. Copy, Falcon lead. Stand by while we analyze. Far below, in the depths of Sector 47, the command center was a hum of low voices and typing. Until suddenly, a junior communications officer nearly fell out of his chair as he shouted, Sir, we're receiving a priority encrypted signal from the unidentified aircraft. Colonel James Patterson, commander of the sector, strode over in 3 quick, deliberate steps. His voice was gravel, controlled but sharp. What kind of signal? The comms officer's hands flew over his keyboard as his voice cracked slightly. It's a clearance code, sir. High-level encryption. I'm decrypting now. Patterson's jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck visible. In 23 years of service, he had never, not once, seen an unauthorized aircraft transmit clearance codes, let alone at this level. Whatever this was, it was either the most sophisticated enemy deception he'd ever encountered, or something operating far, far above his own clearance. "How long for full decryption?" he demanded. 30 seconds, the officer answered, his voice steadier now. "Then do it." The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath as the main display screen flickered. Algorithms churned through layer after layer of military-grade encryption, the progress bar crawling forward. Then, well, with a final blink, bold red letters appeared on the screen. "Clearance level, Nightshade Authority, Presidential Directive 7 Signatory, Secretary of Defense." The command center went completely silent. Every murmur died. Fingers froze over keyboards. The only sound left in the cavernous space was the faint, steady hum of the electronics surrounding them, filling the silence with a quiet, oppressive weight. The distant hiss of radio chatter from the F-16 pilots filled the air, their voices clipped and tense as they maintained a tight intercept formation. In the command center of Sector 47, Colonel James Patterson stood frozen before the glowing screens, his normally ruddy face drained of all color. His eyes locked on the words blinking across his tactical display. Nightshade clearance. Even whispered rumors of that designation had been rare in his long career, the kind of code you only heard in hushed tones during the most secretive Pentagon briefings. And now it was sitting right there on his screen, under his watch. He swallowed hard and grabbed the secure red phone, its smooth handset heavier in his hand than he remembered. The direct line to Pentagon operations. His voice was low, almost cracking, as he spoke into it. "Sector 47 Command, requesting immediate verification of a Nightshade clearance authorization code." He read off the string of numbers displayed on the monitor, forcing his voice to stay steady even though his pulse was hammering. For 45 agonizing seconds, the line was silent except for a faint hum. Then it rang back. Patterson snatched it up. "Colonel Patterson," a calm, authoritative voice replied, "this clearance is verified. The aircraft currently in your airspace is conducting authorized operations under Direct Presidential Directive 7. All military personnel are to provide full cooperation and support. Do not, repeat, do not interfere with this mission." The call cut off, leaving Patterson standing there with his hand still gripping the handset, fingers stiff. He hung up slowly, feeling his stomach drop. In all his years of service, he had never, not once, seen authority so absolute, bypassing every level of military hierarchy as though it didn't even exist. His hands trembled as he keyed his microphone to the pilots above. "Falcon Flight, this is Control," he began, his voice tight. "Immediate orders. Disengage from intercept. Repeat, disengage immediately and maintain a respectful distance." A beat of silence followed, broken by the skeptical tone of the lead pilot. "IE Control, say again. Target remains non-responsive. Requesting confirmation." Patterson's reply cracked with stress. "Falcon Lead, stand down now. That aircraft has presidential authorization. You are ordered to escort, not intercept. Do you copy?" In the cockpit of the lead F-16, Captain Mike Torres stared out at the sleek, unmarked civilian aircraft in front of him, his hands tightening on the stick. He felt the ground shift under everything he thought he understood about rules of engagement. He had been seconds away from firing a warning burst at a target shielded by the highest possible authority in the United States. It was his wingman who broke the silence first. The younger pilot's earlier cocky attitude was gone, replaced by a nervous, almost comical formality as he radioed, "Ma'am, on behalf of the squadron, we apologize for any inconvenience. And your aircraft looks fantastic. A timeless design, ma'am." On the internal comms, Torres hissed sharply, "Shut up." Listening from her cockpit, Rachel Monroe couldn't help herself. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips, a genuine one, the kind she hadn't felt in a long time. The kid's awkward attempt to save face after his earlier swagger was so transparent it almost charmed her. She finally keyed her own mic, her voice cool but not unkind. "Falcon Flight, you performed exactly as you should have. That's the point." Above Sector 47, 3 F-16 Fighting Falcons now flanked the small, unassuming unassuming civilian plane in a precise escort, their earlier steel-edged posture replaced by something closer to reverence. Rachel's aircraft had just proven, without firing a shot, that there were some clearances more powerful than any weapon. Even the threat of missiles had to be silenced. Even fighters had to bow because some orders didn't come from the sky. They came from quiet signatures on desks in rooms of power. And when it came to the chain of command, whose word really carried the weight? The pilot circling in the clouds, or the unseen hand that wrote the orders they could not disobey? Within minutes of that verification, secure phone lines across the Pentagon began buzzing with urgency. In offices most service members never even knew existed, the name Rachel Monroe lit up screens and tripped alerts buried deep in classified databases. General Patricia Hayes, Director of Defense Operations, was halfway through her morning coffee when her secure line rang. She answered, already bracing herself. "Ma'am," said a clipped, nervous voice, "we have a nightshade clearance activation in Sector 47. The operative identified is Rachel Monroe." Hayes set her cup down carefully and leaned toward her secure terminal, fingers moving quickly to call up the relevant file. It took a biometric scan to unlock. When the name appeared in green at the top of the screen, she felt the faintest chill despite herself. "Confirm that Major Rachel Monroe is conducting authorized operations," Hayes said flatly. "Yes, ma'am. Full presidential directive authority. Local command is requesting clarification on her mission parameters." Hayes allowed herself a grim smile. "Tell them they don't need to know her mission parameters," she said coolly. "That was their quarterly security assessment, and they didn't even know it." Back in the Sector 47 Command Center, Colonel Patterson remained standing stiffly at his post, still struggling to absorb what had just transpired. He stared at the screen where the civilian aircraft continued its steady flight, flanked by his best pilots like watchful sentinels. He had never heard of Rachel Monroe, but judging by her clearance, her authority clearly reached levels so high above him he couldn't even begin to see the top. And that, he realized with a sinking feeling, was probably the point. The young communications officer's voice cut through the quiet tension of the command center, pitched with unease. "Sir," he called out to Colonel Patterson, "we're receiving additional intel on the aircraft. It's, it's marked as a Project Guardian asset." The words hit Patterson like ice water. His blood ran cold at the mention. Project Guardian. Even in his decades of service, the name carried only the vaguest contours, a legend whispered in classified circles. A program so deeply buried in compartmentalization that even senior commanders like him were kept in the dark about its true scope. He'd always assumed it was more myth than reality, a cautionary tale of overreach and paranoia. But here it was, stamped on his radar screen. And it was real. Operators tied to that designation, he knew, were rumored to have authority and capabilities that lay far outside the normal military chain of command. In some telling, they could override generals, vanish entire operations, walk through the strictest protocols like they didn't exist. Patterson stared at the readout, willing it to make sense. "Get me everything we have on Project Guardian," he ordered tersely. The officer hesitated. "Sir, our clearance level doesn't allow access to those files." Of course it didn't. Patterson exhaled slowly, the understanding settling heavy in his chest. What he'd just witnessed was not, and never had been, a routine military exercise. Above him, high in the clear sky over Sector 47, Rachel Monroe moved with calm precision. Every maneuver she executed was deliberate. Every turn of her sleek craft calculated to expose vulnerabilities in the sector's defense grid. She worked silently, methodically, testing the radar net's reach, probing the response times of scrambling interceptors, analyzing how efficiently ground controllers coordinated under stress. Even the way she cut across restricted corridors was a subtle challenge to see if anyone dared call her bluff. On a secure frequency, a frequency that technically did not even exist on civilian aircraft, her radio crackled. "Guardian Actual, this is Pentagon Operations. Status report." Rachel keyed her encrypted mic with a practiced thumb. Her voice was cool, professional. "Pentagon Operations, Guardian Actual, Phase 1 complete. Local response time, 6 minutes, 40 seconds. Threat escalation, appropriate. Command structure, functional under pressure. Clearance verification. Delayed but ultimately effective. A beat of silence, then the voice replied, "Copy, Guardian Actual. Any recommendations?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "Recommend enhanced training on high-level clearance protocols." Local command performed admirably, but showed hesitation when confronted with authority levels outside their experience. Overall assessment, satisfactory, with room for improvement. Understood, Guardian Actual. You are cleared for Phase 2 if conditions warrant. She glanced at the mission parameters displayed on her console. Phase 2 would have tested the base's ability to coordinate with civilian air traffic during an ongoing security incident. But Rachel had already gathered more than enough data for today's evaluation. She depressed her mic switch again. Pentagon Operations, Guardian Actual recommends canceling Phase 2. Local forces have demonstrated sufficient competency. No further testing required. Copy that, Guardian Actual. Return to base when ready. Job well done. In his F-16 off her wing, Captain Mike Torres couldn't help himself. Curiosity gnawed at him as he kept station on her flank. He toggled to a discrete frequency and called across the ether. "Ma'am, if I may, what exactly did we just experience?" Rachel let the question hang for a moment, weighing what she could reveal without breaching the veil of operational secrecy. Finally, she answered, her words measured. "Captain, you just participated in a security evaluation that most people will never know took place. Your squadron performed exactly as it should have when confronted by an unknown threat. That performance will help improve defense protocols across the entire military." Torres was quiet but not satisfied. "Ma'am, are you saying this was all just a test?" She allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile. "I'm saying that freedom and security require constant vigilance, Captain. And sometimes that vigilance means testing our own systems, so we know they'll hold when it matters most." There was a pause, then Torres's voice again, softer now, almost to himself. "How often does this happen?" Rachel's reply was even quieter. "More often than you might think, and less often than we'd like." Far below in the command center, Colonel Patterson sat at his desk, reading what little his clearance allowed him to learn about Project Guardian. The sparse briefing on his screen confirmed what his instincts already suspected. The program had been established as a shadow effort to conduct rigorous, unannounced security assessments of critical defense infrastructure, controlled penetrations, simulated incursions. The language was clinical, but the meaning was stark. Rachel Monroe, Guardian Actual, was authorized to attack American military installations without warning, to test their readiness to repel real threats. And her authority came straight from the highest levels of government, bypassing every conventional chain of command. Patterson picked up his secure phone, his fingers tightening around the receiver, and began dialing his superior at Air Force Operations. There were questions he needed answered. And after tonight, well, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear them. Everything that unfolded during our encounter was entirely authentic. She began, her voice calm, but carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd been there, seen more than she could ever say, and survived. Your responses, your protocols, your decision-making, none of it was staged, and none of it was insignificant. Rachel let her eyes sweep slowly across the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who had scrambled jets to intercept her, who had held their nerve when a sleek, unfamiliar aircraft with unclear clearance entered their airspace. They were watching her now with a mix of professional focus and something else, respect, and maybe a touch of pride that they'd passed whatever invisible test she'd thrown at them. In the front row, Captain Torres sat ramrod straight, hands folded on his knees, his expression alert, but no longer confused. He looked every bit the leader she'd hoped to see in the skies that morning. Just behind him, she caught sight of the wingman who'd made that offhand remark about her aircraft being classic. He shifted in his seat when their eyes met, the faintest flush of embarrassment coloring his face. But he held her gaze. Rachel allowed the faintest hint of a smile to soften her features before she continued. "On that morning, everything you did was recorded, evaluated, and discussed. And I can tell you this much, you upheld your oaths. You kept your composure under pressure. You adapted to the unknown, and you followed your chain of command exactly as you've been trained. That is the essence of readiness." She paused then, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for her words to sink in. Somewhere near the back of the room, a junior controller shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Rachel's thoughts briefly drifted back to that moment 2 weeks earlier as her aircraft left the edge of Sector 47's airspace. Even then, she'd been impressed, not just by their flying, though their escort formation had been impeccable, but by how they'd managed their fear and their questions in real time. They'd stayed professional even when the situation made no sense, even when their own commanding officer had been kept in the dark. She remembered the call she'd overheard as she departed, Colonel Patterson's voice low and tense as he tried to square what he'd witnessed with what he was being told. "Command, sir, this is Colonel Patterson at Sector 47. I need to report a security assessment that just occurred in our airspace." In the cold, clipped reply from the Pentagon, "Was it announced through proper channels?" "No, sir. That appears to have been intentional." "Then you have nothing to report, Colonel. Guardian operations are self-contained and self-reporting. Your job is to return to normal operations and forget this ever happened." She'd almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Even now, she could picture his face as he'd pressed on, pushing back despite knowing he wouldn't get real answers. "Sir, my personnel are asking questions. How do I explain what they witnessed?" "You tell them they performed their duties admirably when faced with an unknown situation. Nothing more. Guardian operations are compartmentalized for a reason." That reason, Rachel thought now as she stood in front of them, was staring back at her. To test them, to push them to their limits without warning, to make sure they could handle what real threats would throw at them. Her eyes landed back on Captain Torres. He was still watching her closely, and she could almost hear his words from 2 weeks ago as she'd broken radio silence to acknowledge the Falcon Flight escort. "Falcon Flight, this is Guardian Actual. I want you to know that your response today was exemplary. You followed protocol, maintained professionalism under pressure, and adapted quickly to changing circumstances. Your country is safer because of pilots like you." She'd heard the pride in his reply then, tempered with the inevitable question, "Ma'am, will we ever know the results of today's assessment?" And she told him the truth because that was part of the lesson too. "Captain, the fact that you performed your duties without knowing you were being evaluated is the best possible result. Real threats don't announce themselves or provide advance warning. Today proved that when genuine danger appears, this base is ready." That had been her final transmission before turning toward cruising altitude, her secure sat phone buzzing not long after with General Hayes' voice on the line. "Guardian Actual Rachel, this is General Hayes. Preliminary reports indicate a successful operation. How did they handle the clearance verification?" "Some initial hesitation," she'd replied honestly, "but they followed protocol correctly. I'd recommend additional training on high-level authorization procedures, but overall they performed well." "Excellent. Your next assignment will be Sector 23 next month. Think they'll be ready?" Rachel had smiled at that, watching the clouds thin beneath her as her jet climbed higher. They'll have to be. Freedom doesn't take appointments. Some tests she knew were designed to be passed. Others were meant to reveal the truth. That day, Sector 47 had endured both. Now, standing in their briefing room, she could see Ed in their faces, that knowledge, that quiet confidence of people who had been tested and hadn't broken. Rachel took a final breath, steady and assured, and concluded, "You have proven yourselves under conditions you didn't expect, facing an adversary you couldn't name. That is what makes you ready for what comes next. That is what makes this country safe." She caught the smallest flicker of pride in Colonel Patterson's eyes as he stood beside her. Beyond him, Captain Torres straightened a little taller, and the wingman's embarrassed flush had given way to something brighter, resolve. Rachel allowed herself one last small smile as she thought ahead to Sector 23. Somewhere out there, another group was waiting to be tested, and she would be ready. All of it had been real. They hadn't known they were being evaluated, which had made their reactions raw, unfiltered, and deeply telling. That authenticity was why Rachel Monroe had been sent here in the first place. A young air traffic controller, still so new to the uniform that his collar looked stiff, raised his hand timidly, glancing toward her before speaking. "Ma'am, how often do these assessments actually happen?" Rachel's eyes swept the room, catching not just him, but the quiet unease in all their faces. "More often than you expect," she said plainly. her voice carrying the faint rasp of someone who'd given more briefings than she could count. National security doesn't allow for complacency. We have to verify constantly that our defenses function as designed. You can't wait for a real crisis to find out where the cracks are. Captain Mike Torres, standing near the front, finally gave voice to the question that was hanging in the air like static. Did we pass? For the first time all day, Rachel smiled. Not a wide, comforting smile, but something small and sharp-edged, like someone who'd learned long ago that honesty mattered more than reassurance. Captain, she said, turning to him, you exceeded expectations in several areas. Response time was excellent. Escalation procedures, textbook. Most importantly, you adapted professionally when faced with authority levels outside your usual chain of experience. That, she added, gesturing toward the glowing tactical display on the wall, is something you can't train into someone. It has to come from judgment and discipline. She let the compliment settle for a beat before continuing, her tone shifting to business. However, there are areas for improvement. Your clearance verification process took longer than optimal. In a real scenario where time-sensitive intelligence is involved, those minutes could be critical. Lives could depend on them. Colonel James Patterson, his uniform crisp and his expression thoughtful, nodded once. What would you recommend? Rachel's reply came without hesitation. Regular drills specifically designed around high-level authorization scenarios. Your people need to get used to seeing clearances they don't see every day and processing them without freezing up. The hesitation we observed wasn't incompetence, she added, glancing around the room, making sure the weight of her words landed without unnecessary sting. It was simply lack of exposure. The briefing continued, but now it was Rachel doing most of the talking, sharing insights no manual could teach, no checklist could cover. She spoke of the psychology of threat assessment, of the professional mindset required to maintain composure in the fog of uncertainty. She outlined, with clear-eyed precision, the fragile balance between airtight security and the flexibility operational reality demands. By the time the session wrapped, officers lingered instead of filing out. One by one they approached her, some hesitant, some bold, all wanting to understand not just the technical takeaways but the deeper, disquieting implications of living in a world where tests like these were not just possible but necessary. A young lieutenant, barely out of his 20s, finally voiced the question that had been simmering in the room. Ma'am, he asked quietly, how can we tell when it's just a test and when it's real? Rachel's gaze softened just slightly, but her voice stayed firm. Lieutenant, she said, that's the point. You can't. You treat every situation as genuine until you know otherwise. The moment you assume it's just an exercise, she paused, letting the silence stretch, is the moment real security breaks down. That evening, an informal gathering was held in the rec hall, a chance for everyone to breathe, to try and make sense of the day. Rachel found herself surrounded by 3 generations of military personnel, veterans and rookies alike, quietly wrestling with their place in a system they'd never fully understood before tonight. Toward the end, the young wingman who'd made the awkward joke about her aircraft earlier finally worked up the nerve to approach. His cheeks were still flushed with embarrassment as he stood at attention in front of her. Ma'am, he began awkwardly, I just wanted to apologize about what I said earlier, but that aircraft, he hesitated, swallowing hard. Where did you even get it? Rachel met his eyes without flinching, her expression unreadable. A friend gave it to me, she said simply. Then, after the briefest pause, the same friend who signed my flight authorization. She reached up and patted his shoulder, lightly, almost kindly, and walked away without another word, leaving him standing there, frozen in place, wearing an expression somewhere between disbelief and awe. Later, Colonel Patterson raised a glass, his voice carrying above the murmur of conversation. To the professionals who keep our skies secure, he said solemnly, whether they know they're being watched or not. And to those who watch the watchers, ensuring that readiness never hardens into complacency. The toast was met with quiet but sincere agreement. The transformation, Rachel thought as she watched them, was complete. Just 2 weeks ago, they'd been competent professionals, good at their balls certainly. But tonight they'd become something more, conscious guardians, newly aware that the freedom they defended required vigilance that never slept. 6 months later, Rachel stood once more, this time before a joint session of military commanders at the Pentagon. The weight of dozens of stars and eagles lined the polished wood table before her. Behind her, a classified presentation glowed on the screen, summarizing the results of security assessments conducted across 47 installations. She looked out at them, colonels and generals who held the keys to the nation's defenses, and began to speak, her voice calm but charged with quiet conviction. "Gentlemen and ma'am," she said, nodding toward General Patricia Hayes, "in today's world, where radars and restrictions govern every inch of our skies, we've found that our greatest vulnerability isn't technological failure. It's human hesitation in the face of authority they don't recognize." She let that truth hang in the air as they listened, and she could see it in their eyes. The dawning understanding that this wasn't just about protocols or planes or screens glowing in the dark. It was about people, always people, and the choices they made when the unexpected came knocking. 6 months ago, at Sector 47, a routine clearance verification had taken exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Rachel Monroe had committed that number to memory. In a real crisis, those few minutes could be the difference between stopping an attack and watching it succeed. She hadn't needed a manual to understand that kind of truth. Some lessons could only be learned in the field. That day, seated at the end of a long, polished table surrounded by uniforms and stars, she stood as guardian actual, though nobody here used her old call sign. A two-star general raised his hand, his voice crisp. "Captain Monroe, what's your recommendation for improving the authorization protocols?" Rachel met his gaze evenly, her tone measured but resolute. "Sir, the answer isn't faster computers or stronger encryption. Those are tools. But tools are useless if people don't trust them. The problem we've created is cultural. We've trained personnel to question the very system they're supposed to rely on whenever they see authority levels beyond their own experience. We've compartmentalized our security so thoroughly that even our own people hesitate to comply." She clicked to the next slide, the screen behind her filling with graphs and numbers that told a consistent, troubling story. "Every installation we tested showed the same pattern," she continued. "Excellent initial response, appropriate threat escalation, but significant delays once higher-level clearances came into play. This isn't a failure of our people. It's a failure of our training. We've prepared them to spot threats, but not to recognize authority when it walks through their door." The room went quiet as her words settled over the table. For the next hour, Rachel walked them through her full recommendations, a reshaping of how the armed forces would approach authority verification in crisis. Her ideas were precise, her delivery calm, but her conviction never wavered. This was her mission now. When the session finally broke, the men and women in the room began gathering their papers, quiet discussions buzzing. But General Patricia Hayes, Director of Defense Operations, stayed behind and caught up to Rachel privately near the door. "Rachel," the general said, her tone softer than it had been during the briefing, "in all your assessments, what's the most important thing you've learned?" Rachel took a moment before answering, her eyes thoughtful. "Ma'am," she said finally, "I've learned that real security isn't about sealing every single crack or preventing every intrusion. That's impossible. It's about knowing exactly how to respond the moment someone with legitimate authority appears in your space." General Hayes tilted her head, considering her words. "And the human element?" she pressed. "How do we prepare people for situations they've never faced before?" Rachel allowed herself the faintest smile. "We remind them that authority doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, carrying clearances they've never even heard of. And in that moment, they need to trust the system they serve." That evening, Rachel returned to her office, her steps slower now, but no less purposeful. On her wall hung a simple plaque she often glanced at when the weight of her work pressed too hard. "Guardian Operations, testing the systems that protect freedom." She sat at her desk, reviewing her next assignment. Sector 23, a new set of pilots, fresh controllers, another opportunity to make sure America's defenses stayed razor sharp. She flipped through the file, already thinking of how to approach it. Then her secure phone rang, the familiar tone cutting through the quiet. She answered instantly. "Guardian Actual." "Rachel, this is Pentagon Operations," came the voice on the line. "We have a priority assessment request." Naval Air Station Norfolk reports unusual activity in their restricted zones. Immediate evaluation requested. Her hand was already reaching for the black flight bag on the chair beside her. She smiled faintly, a quiet, knowing smile. The work never ended, and that was exactly how it should be. "Copy, Pentagon operations," she replied, her voice steady. "Guardian Actual is en route." She drove to the airfield in the gathering dusk, her citation waiting on the tarmac like a silver blade ready to be unsheathed. As she approached the jet, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, the truth she carried with her settling over her shoulders like a familiar jacket. In a world where threats never stopped evolving, the only way to stay ready was to test readiness relentlessly. Some people flew for glory, others flew for adventure. Rachel flew for something else entirely, to ensure that when the real danger finally came, America's guardians would be ready to meet it. Above her, radar controllers tracked her departure on their screens, watching her climb into the darkening sky. They didn't know it yet, but somewhere in their own future, they too might face a quiet test, one they'd never see coming, from authority that didn't shout but simply cleared the way.